So, I don't know exactly how I came up with this idea, but I did. And now that I'm writing this, I'm still a little shocked that it actually happened. It all started in the summer, just a few months ago. It was one of those perfect California Saturdays. Warm but not unbearable, the kind of day where the sun hangs lazily in the sky and makes everything glow. We were in my backyard, celebrating my move. I had just bought this house, a simple but cozy American home with a little backyard and, the most interesting part, a treehouse. A family had lived here before me, and they must have put a lot of love into that little wooden hideaway. It wasn't just a rickety platform with a few boards nailed together. It had a roof, a little window, even a tiny wooden bench inside. From the outside, it looked sturdy and well-built, a nostalgic relic from the childhood of some kids I'd never meet. Spoiler. It was not sturdy at all, but more on that later. So there we were, sipping drinks and lounging in the backyard, my friends scattered around. Some on the patio, some sitting on the grass, all in that perfect lazy weekend mode. My best friend Emma was mid-story, talking about this swing party she had gone to the weekend before. Now Emma has stories. She's the kind of person who never says no to an invitation and somehow always ends up in the most outrageous situations. And when she tells a story, she tells it in a way that makes you feel like you were there, experiencing every twist and turn firsthand. She was describing it with this mix of humor and intrigue, going on about the atmosphere, the way people just seemed so open, so free. I was half listening, half gazing up at the treehouse, letting my mind wander when, out of nowhere, the words just slipped out of my mouth. "Let's have a swing party in the treehouse." Emma stopped mid-sentence and blinked at me. Then she burst out laughing. "You're joking." Shrugged. "Why not? It would be a good experience." The rest of our friends, who had been lost in their own conversations, started tuning in. A few eyebrows raised, a couple of smirks, and then the usual questions. Was I serious? Did I even know how to organize something like that? Would the treehouse even hold that many people? That last question was a fair one. We all ended up gathering around, staring up at the wooden structure like it held the answers to the universe. Someone joked that we'd probably need to sign waivers. Someone else wondered if we could even get inside. That led to the next mission, figuring out how to get in. First, it was frustrating. The usual ladder that should have been attached was long gone, probably taken down by the previous owners. We spent 20 minutes walking around the tree, poking at it, looking for some secret, hidden way up like it was a puzzle we just hadn't solved yet. Then Emma found it. On the other side of the tree, nailed into the trunk, was a wooden ladder. It blended in so well with the bark that we had missed it entirely. Climbing up was a challenge, but when we finally got inside, we realized it was actually pretty spacious. 4 or 5 people could fit in there easily. Maybe more if we weren't worried about comfort. The walls were covered in old carvings, probably from the kids who had lived there before. Names, dates, little doodles. Felt like stepping into someone else's memories. Emma turned to me with that mischievous grin of hers. "Okay," she said. "You're right. This could be fun." And that was the beginning of something I never could have predicted. The next morning, reality hit me. If we were actually going to pull this off, we needed to get serious. The treehouse was a mess, the kind of mess that years of dust, forgotten leaves, and abandoned spider webs create. It wasn't just about making it look presentable. We had to make sure it was safe. Emma and I started early, grabbing trash bags and brooms, determined to turn this childhood relic into the scene of something completely unexpected. I climbed up first, already regretting it as a loose plank creaked ominously under my foot. Not exactly reassuring. The inside was covered in old stickers, crude drawings carved into the walls, and at least 3 bottle caps wedged into the wooden floor. It had history, that was for sure. We got to work, sweeping away years of neglect, tossing out anything questionable, and trying not to think about what might be lurking in the corners. At one point, Emma pulled out what looked like a chewed-up pencil and held it up like it was an ancient artifact. "Imagine the secrets this treehouse holds," she said dramatically. I rolled my eyes. Yeah, like how many kids got grounded for sneaking up here. By midday, we had the place looking semi-decent. Then came the next issue, privacy. The neighbor's house was perfectly positioned to have a clear view of the treehouse, and considering our plans, that was not ideal. So we covered the small window with black tape, effectively turning the treehouse into a tiny makeshift hideout. Not the most elegant solution, but desperate times, right? After lunch, I decided to take things up a notch. If we were going to do this, it should feel like a proper event. That meant food, drinks, and some level of comfort. I dragged out my old barbecue from the garage and set it up in the yard. A swing party with grilled steaks and wine. Sounded ridiculous, but in the best way. We weren't just doing this, we were celebrating my move in style. Then I'll climb the treehouse again. Then came the splinter. I was wiping down the wooden bench inside when I felt the sharp sting in my finger. Pulling my hand back, I saw the tiniest sliver of wood embedded under my skin. Ow, okay, new problem, I muttered. Emma looked up from below. What happened? Splinter. And now I'm realizing that if I got one just by wiping the bench, someone else could get one. Anywhere. Emma burst out laughing. Imagine mid-party. Someone just yelps because they got a splinter in the worst possible spot. I cringed. Yeah, I don't want to be responsible for that kind of injury. We added covering the wood to our to-do list. We searched for any old blankets or cushions that could act as a buffer between skin and splinter-prone surfaces. Not exactly high-end, but better than an impromptu trip to the ER. By evening, the treehouse was officially party-ready. Clean, private, and hopefully splinter-proof. We stood back looking at our work, feeling equal parts excited and nervous. A few people had already declined, convinced the whole structure would collapse the second we set foot inside. Others just weren't into the idea at all. But a few just enough were in. As the sun set, I realized we had done it. We had actually turned this crazy thought into something real. Now, all that was left was to see if the treehouse could survive the night. Time finally came. I had spent the entire day preparing, making sure everything was perfect. The treehouse was as ready as it would ever be. The food was set, and the wine was poured. Now, all that was left was to see who would actually show up. When the doorbell rang, I took a deep breath, expecting a group of familiar faces. Instead, standing there was Brian. Just Brian. He was one of my closest friends, the kind of guy who never said no when I asked him to come over. Reliable, easygoing, and always down for an adventure. Smiled. Of course, you'd be the first one here. Obviously, he smirked, stepping inside. I waited a few more minutes, expecting others to arrive, but before anyone else could show up, someone unexpected did. Calvin. My shock was immediate. I hadn't invited him. Not because I didn't like him, but because he wasn't exactly part of my usual crowd. Yet, here he was, standing in my doorway, grinning like he belonged. You didn't think I'd miss this, did you? He said casually, stepping inside like he had been personally invited. Calvin was a big guy. Probably around 90 kilograms, easy. I had no idea how the treehouse was going to handle him, but that was a problem for later. And then, thankfully, Emma arrived. My best friend, my partner in crime. Seeing her face instantly made everything feel right again. So, she said, looking around. Is this it? I nodded slowly. Yeah. I thought more people would come. Well, more wine for us then, she said, grabbing a glass. Despite the smaller turnout, I was determined to enjoy the night. We sat around, eating steaks fresh off the grill, sipping wine, laughing about the ridiculousness of the situation. Calvin, as expected, was the most excited about getting into the treehouse. He kept glancing at it, barely paying attention to the conversation. Can we go up now? He asked, practically bouncing in his chair. I laughed. Patience, Calvin. Best for last. Once the food was finished, the moment finally arrived. Emma and I climbed up first, testing the structure. The wooden boards held steady. No creaks, no alarming shifts. Good sign. Brian followed next, then Calvin. He got up with surprising ease, considering his size, and soon we were all inside. I took a deep breath, soaking in the moment. We had actually done it. The treehouse, against all odds, was holding up. The atmosphere was perfect. The warm night air, the soft glow from the backyard lights, the laughter. Felt surreal in the best way. I had set this goal to throw a swing party in a treehouse, and here we were actually making it happen. Everything was going smoothly. Too smoothly. Something happened here that nobody expected, and I'll tell you all about it. But first, let me explain what led up to the chaos. Because the treehouse was so small, Calvin had very limited options. He could only lie down or kneel, and of course he whined about it non-stop. "I don't feel comfortable at all," he kept repeating, shifting around as if he expected the place to magically expand for his benefit. Then, after a few minutes of fidgeting, he finally settled, stretching out on his back and sighing dramatically. "Oh yes," he muttered. "Oh yes, that's much better." Emma and I exchanged a glance, barely holding in our laughter. With Calvin sprawled out and useless, the rest of us were left to do all the work, whatever that work actually was in that moment. The goal was to have fun, but between Calvin's complaints and the treehouse's questionable sturdiness, things were already teetering toward disaster. And then disaster struck. Calvin, still lounging around, was holding onto a piece of wood that was nailed to the tree. It had been there for who knows how long, and logically, none of us would have thought to grab it for support. But Calvin had other ideas. When he decided to get up on his knees, he thought that flimsy piece of wood would be a great thing to hold onto. So, he grabbed it and started pulling himself up. The moment his weight shifted, we heard it. Clack. The sound was so loud that we all froze. The board Calvin was gripping tilted dangerously, and because of the way he was pulling, his entire weight leaned to the left. For one terrifying second, everything seemed to move in slow motion. Calvin wobbled, the board gave way, and then the board fell. And so did Calvin. What happened next was chaos. Brian, unfortunately positioned near the broken wood, got splinters in the worst place imaginable. His scream was immediate and ear-piercing. Emma and I scrambled to move, but in the panic I managed to hit my head against the wall, and Emma slammed her pelvis hard against the floor. Calvin, well, he didn't just fall. He practically rolled, landing in a mess of scratches and splinters, groaning dramatically about how much everything hurt. We were all in pain, groaning and cursing, but the worst part, it wasn't over. Not even close. For a moment there was just silence. That eerie kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. We all stared at each other, processing what had just happened, when suddenly, we heard another creak. Brian, still clutching his unfortunate splinter wound, widened his eyes. "No way," he whispered. Another creak. Then a snap. And before we knew it, the entire floor of the treehouse began to shift beneath us. Panic set in instantly. "Get out!" Emma shouted, scrambling toward the opening. Brian, despite his obvious pain, pushed himself up and started moving. Calvin, still groaning about his scratches, suddenly found a new burst of energy and practically dove toward the entrance. I tried to follow, but my foot caught on one of the fallen wooden planks. As I struggled to untangle myself, I felt the entire structure lurch to the side. The treehouse wasn't just falling apart, it was actively collapsing. With one final, deafening crunch, a large section of the floor gave way completely. Emma had already made it down. Brian and Calvin had practically thrown themselves out. But I was still inside. "Move, move," Emma shouted from below. I had no choice. I scrambled toward the edge and jumped just as the last section of the floor gave way beneath me. I landed in the dirt with a hard thud, knocking the wind out of myself. My head was spinning, my body aching, but at least I wasn't trapped in the pile of wreckage that had once been my treehouse. For a moment, none of us said anything. We just lay there, catching our breath, staring at what was left of the treehouse. Then Calvin, still sprawled in the dirt, let out a dramatic groan. "So, do we call this a success or?" Emma burst out laughing. Brian, still wincing, gave him a half-hearted thumbs up. And me. I just lay there, staring at the sky, wondering how on earth this night had turned into a full-blown demolition project. I don't even know where to begin with what happened next. 1 minute, we were all lying there groaning in pain, trying to process the disaster that had just unfolded. The next, we were realizing something much, much worse. We were in the backyard. completely exposed. And worse, we had no clothes on. Took me a few seconds to register it. The cool night air, the feeling of grass under my skin, then the horror set in. I scrambled up so fast I nearly tripped over myself, my head still throbbing from the impact. Emma, still recovering from slamming her pelvis against the floor, gasped. Brian winced, shifting uncomfortably as he nursed his wounds. And Calvin was just lying there, groaning dramatically like he'd just survived a plane crash. Then I saw her, my neighbor, the old lady from next door, standing by her window watching us. She saw everything. My heart stopped. My stomach dropped. I had no idea what she was thinking, but I knew she had been watching long enough to get a full view of the catastrophe that had just occurred. Her expression was unreadable, somewhere between curiosity and absolute horror. I couldn't tell if she was about to call the police or just go back to watching her nightly soap opera like nothing happened. "Get inside." "Now," I hissed, yanking Emma's arm as I bolted toward the house. Calvin groaned, still lying there. "I think I broke something." Somehow, we all managed to scramble inside, slamming the door shut behind us. We were breathing heavily, eyes wide, adrenaline still pumping. No one said anything for a second. Then Brian, still in pain from his unfortunate splinter accident, let out a sharp yelp. That snapped us back to reality. We rushed to the bathroom, pulling out every bottle of peroxide and first aid supply I owned. Calvin was whining, of course. "This is the worst thing that's ever happened to me," he moaned. I wanted to scream. The entire party had gone so horribly wrong. I had set out to throw something fun, something spontaneous, and instead I had nearly keyed my friends, flashed my elderly neighbor, and now had to deal with injuries that probably needed medical attention. "I'm sorry," I muttered, rubbing my temples. "I'm sorry this happened. I'm sorry I even suggested it." Emma, pressing an ice pack against her hip, gave me a weak smile. "It's definitely unforgettable." Calvin, being Calvin, shook his head dramatically. "Whoa, this was a disaster. A complete failure." And then, a few days later, it got worse. Everyone knew. Calvin had told people. Everyone. Not just our close friends, but somehow the story spread like wildfire. Suddenly, people I barely knew were coming up to me asking if it was true. "The treehouse party. That was you." I wanted to disappear. And to make it even worse, Calvin wasn't just telling the story. He was blaming me. "The worst swing party I've ever been to," he kept saying. And it was all her fault. I was mortified. My reputation was toast. I couldn't believe how quickly the disaster had become the talk of the town. So we did what we had to do. We dismantled the treehouse. Burned it to the ground. Emma and Brian helped, still laughing about it as they tore the boards apart. Calvin watched from the sidelines, pouting like he was still in pain. "We will never do something like this again," I vowed, watching the flames consume the last remnants of my failed idea. And yet, as much as I regretted it, as much as I wanted to erase the whole thing from existence, I knew one thing for sure. This night would never be forgotten. One last thing. Never ever have a swing party in a treehouse. Or better yet, don't have one at all.